What do you think is the oldest restaurant in Florida? No, seriously, take a guess. And I don't mean like the kind of old place that just looks like it's been there forever, but the real deal, the place where they've been serving up meals for over 100 years. And it's the Columbia Restaurant right there in Ybor City, Tampa, Florida's oldest continuously operated restaurant. And let me tell you, this place has stories more than just being a spot for killer Cuban sandwiches and that famous 1905 salad. It's like a time capsule that's held onto the cultural heartbeat of Ybor for, get this, nearly 120 years. Wild, right? Today, we're diving deep into the history of the Columbia. We're talking family legacies, Ybor's cigar boom, prohibition loopholes, and even how this one restaurant helped shape Tampa into what it is today. There's a lot to unpack. So grab a seat and maybe a cafecito while you're at it, because we're going to be here for a bit. I'm Bo Carter, and this is Old Florida Now. Let's dig in.
Welcome to Old Florida Now, where we uncover the rich history and hidden stories of the Sunshine State. Each episode will explore the people, places, and events that shaped Florida's past. Let's dive in.
So let's talk about how this whole thing started back in 1905. Picture this. Casimiro Hernandez Sr., a Cuban immigrant, rolls into Ybor City. Now, if you know Ybor, you know it was the hub for cigar workers at the time. I mean, we're talking late 1800s, early 1900s. There was a huge wave of immigrants, mostly Cuban, Spanish, and Italian, flooding into Tampa to work in these cigar factories. And Casimiro, well, he's one of those folks trying to make a better life for his family. He starts out small, like really small. The Columbia didn't begin as some grand restaurant with multiple locations. No, it was this tiny little corner cafe. They served up Cuban coffee, sandwiches, soups, stuff that could keep these cigar workers going. You've got these guys on a quick break from the factory, grabbing a Cuban sandwich and a hot coffee before heading right back to rolling cigars all day. Honestly, it makes sense, right? I mean, Cuban sandwiches were practically made for those busy cigar workers, quick, hearty, and delicious. The place became this kind of local hangout for Ybor's hardworking folks. Casimiro really tapped into what the community needed. But here's where it gets interesting. Ybor wasn't just this little Tampa neighborhood. It was a melting pot of cultures. And that's reflected in the Columbia's early menu. The Spanish brought ham. The Italians added Genoa salami. And of course, the Cubans came with mojo marinated pork. It's kind of cool to think that the sandwich was evolving just like the community. And who would have thought, right, that this little cafe for cigar workers would grow into the largest Spanish restaurant in the world? Anyway, we'll get into the rest of that journey soon. But for now, picture that. Casimiro cigars and sandwiches on the corner of Ybor City. So Prohibition hits in 1919. And if you've got a business that makes money selling alcohol, well, that's a bit of a problem, right? And Casimiro Hernandez Sr., he was definitely feeling the heat. I mean, the Columbia was known as a saloon serving strong drinks and Cuban coffee to the cigar workers of Ybor City. So what do you do when the government suddenly says, no more booze? Well, Casimiro, he was a smart guy. Instead of throwing in the towel, he gets creative. He looks next door at this little restaurant, La Fonda, owned by the Garcia brothers, and boom, they decide to merge. So now, instead of just serving drinks, the Columbia becomes a full-on restaurant. This kept the place alive when, let's be honest, a lot of other places were folding. They even started serving more of their famous Cuban sandwiches and soups to the cigar workers. And here's the kicker. Even though Prohibition was going on, people weren't exactly, stopping the party. Ybor had its fair share of underground stuff like Bolita, this Cuban lottery game, and folks would still find ways to drink. But now, instead of shots, it's like they're pouring drinks into demi-tasse cups, making it all look innocent. I love that little workaround. It's kind of wild when you think about it. This place could have just shut down like so many others, but instead it kept adapting. That merge with La Fonda, total game changer. Without that, the Columbia might not have made it to, well, what it is today. So, after Casimiro Hernandez Sr. passed away in 1929, his son, Casimiro Jr., took over the family business. Now, think about it for a second. This was the Great Depression. Not exactly the best time to run a restaurant, right? But Casimiro Jr. had big dreams for the Columbia. He wasn't just thinking about feeding folks anymore. He wanted to turn this place into like an entertainment hub. And boy, did he make some moves. And in 1935, smack dab in the middle of the Depression, he goes ahead and builds Tampa's first air-conditioned dining room, the Don Quixote Room. Can you imagine that? It's a hot Florida summer, and you're stepping into a fancy, cool dining room with a dance floor, live music, and oh yeah, a giant crystal chandelier. The man knew how to make a statement. The Don Quixote Room became the spot in Tampa. People didn't just go there to eat. They went to dance, listen to live bands, and just forget about the tough times for a while. Casimiro Jr. basically turned the Columbia into this blend of food and entertainment, which made it a cultural hotspot for Spanish music and dancing. The Columbia wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. It's wild to think about. The restaurant that started as a tiny cafe for cigar workers now had tuxedoed waiters, people dancing, and a menu full of Cuban and Spanish classics. That air-conditioned room, it really put the Columbia on the map as the place to be in Tampa. So after Casimiro Jr. passed away, it was his daughter, Adela, and her husband, Cesar Gaunt-Smart, who took over the Columbia. Now, let me tell you, these two weren't just restaurateurs. They were artists. Adela was a pianist trained at Juilliard, and Cesar, he was a concert violinist. These two brought their love of music and culture right into the heart of the restaurant. And you can really see that artistic influence in the creation of the Siboney Room, which they opened in 1959. It was this grand ballroom packed with art, sculptures, and even fountains. They brought in top Latin performers, and Cesar would sometimes serenade guests with his violin. The place was the spot for live entertainment in Ybor City. But you know, this wasn't exactly an easy time for Ybor City. By the 1950s and 60s, urban renewal was hitting hard. A lot of the old cigar factories were shutting down, and Ybor was in decline. But Cesar wasn't having any of it. He fought to keep the Columbia a cultural landmark, pouring his energy into preserving its significance, even as the neighborhood around it was struggling. Honestly, it's kind of amazing. While so many businesses were fading away, the Columbia stood tall, still a place where you could come for great food, great music, and a slice of that old Ybor magic. Thanks to Adela and Cesar, it wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a cultural institution. So let's talk about how the Columbia started branching out, because it didn't just stay tucked away in Ybor City forever. In the late 1950s, the Gaunt-Smart family had this bold idea to expand the restaurant, and the first stop was Sarasota. Yeah, in 1959, they opened the Columbia in St. Armand Circle, and it's actually the oldest restaurant in Sarasota now. I mean, Sarasota wasn't as developed as it is today, but the restaurant was a hit right out of the gate. From there, the Columbia just kept growing. By 1983, they opened another location in St. Augustine, which, if you've been, you know how perfectly that city's history vibes with the restaurant's whole Spanish theme. It was just a natural fit. Then in 1989, they hit Clearwater Beach's Sand Key, giving people a taste of their famous Cuban sandwiches, and 1905 salad right by the water. Honestly, they just kept the momentum going, expanding to Celebration near Orlando in 1997, and even smaller spots like the Tampa Bay History Center. It's kind of wild to think that what started as a small, humble cafe in Ybor grew into this iconic brand across Florida. Each spot has its own vibe, but no matter where you go, it still feels like you're stepping into a slice of Tampa's history. So one of the coolest things about the Columbia is the way it blends Cuban and Spanish cuisines at every one of its locations. From the original spot in Ybor City to Sarasota, St. Augustine, and beyond, you can find that mix of flavors that just screams Florida. I mean, it's like each bite of paella or a Cuban sandwich isn't just food. It's this nod to the cultural melting pot that built this state. You know, you've got Cuban staples like roast pork, Spanish seafood dishes, and even touches of Italian influence here and there, thanks to Ybor's immigrant history. The 1905 salad, That's a mix of Spanish olives, Swiss cheese, and Cuban mojo. You can't get more Florida fusion than that. It's this perfect blend of tradition and flavor that's made the Colombia a statewide icon. And you know what's wild, whether you're in Sarasota or Clearwater Beach, they've managed to keep that same vibe. No matter how far from Ybor you are, you still get that blend of cultures on your plate. That's why people keep coming back, whether it's for the food, the history, or just a little taste of old Florida. So here's the thing, the Columbia restaurant, it's still family owned, and it's been that way for 5 generations. That's kind of rare, right? You don't see many places these days that stay in the family for over a century, but the Gonsmarts, they're still at the helm, and they've really kept the heart of the place going strong. Right now, we've got Richard Gonsmart leading the charge, along with his daughter, Andrea Gonsmart Williams, who's the 5th generation. And they're not just running a restaurant, they're deeply involved in giving back to the community. Since 1995, they've hosted the Cesar Gonsmart Memorial Golf Tournament, which is named after Richard's father. The tournament's raised a ton of money for causes like cancer research and scholarships. I mean, we're talking millions of dollars over the years. It's kind of wild when you think about it. This family business that started out as a little cafe is not only a statewide icon, but also a major player in charitable work. The legacy here isn't just about great food. It's about making a difference in the community too. All right, let's talk food, because no deep dive into the Columbia restaurant would be complete without mentioning their most famous dish, the 1905 salad. Now, what's cool about this salad is that it wasn't even on the menu when it was first created. Back in the 1940s, one of the waiters, Tony Noriega, got hungry after a long shift and threw together a mix of what he could find in the kitchen: iceberg lettuce, ham, Swiss cheese, green olives, and, of course, this incredible dressing. And that was it, the birth of the 1905 salad. And honestly, what makes it so special is the dressing. It's a blend of Spanish olive oil, garlic, lemon, oregano, and a secret ingredient, Worcestershire sauce. The flavors just pop, and it's a perfect reflection of the Spanish and Cuban fusion that the Columbia is known for. I mean, you've got the Spanish influences in the olive oil and cheese, and the Cuban flavors with the ham and that tangy dressing. It's no wonder this thing became their signature dish. But it's not just the salad. The Columbia's menu is filled with Spanish-Cuban fusion dishes that really tell the story of Ybor City's immigrant past. You've got arroz con pollo and Cuban sandwiches. All these dishes have been shaped by the cultural mix of Ybor over the years, and it's a big reason why people keep coming back. So if you haven't tried the 1905 salad, you're missing out on a piece of Florida food history. It's the kind of dish that when you take a bite, you're tasting more than just the ingredients. You're tasting a bit of the past. And another cool part is they make it right at your table. So let's dive into just how much the Columbia restaurant has shaped Ybor City and honestly all of Tampa over the years. The place didn't just survive history. It became a huge part of preserving it. I mean, you walk into that restaurant today and you're not just sitting down for a meal. You're stepping into 100+ years of cultural legacy. When Casimiro Hernandez Sr. opened the Columbia back in 1905, Ybor City was this booming hub for cigar manufacturing, and the neighborhood was packed with Cuban, Spanish, and Italian immigrants. The Columbia became their go-to spot, a place where people could grab a coffee, share a meal, and feel a little bit of home. But here's the thing. It wasn't just about the food. The Columbia played a massive role in keeping Ybor's cultural heartbeat going, especially when things got rough. By the 1950s and 60s, a lot of the cigar factories had shut down, and Ybor was kind of on the decline. But the Columbia, it held on. Cesar Gonsmart, who took over the restaurant, made sure it stayed not just alive, but thriving. He helped keep the area's history intact, fighting to preserve Ybor when much of it was being lost to urban renewal projects. It's funny. Today, Ybor City is known as a cultural destination, a place where you can feel that mix of Spanish, Cuban, and Italian influences, and the Columbia is right at the center of that. It's not just the oldest restaurant in Florida, it's a pillar of history that's been serving up food and culture for over a century. Okay, so if you've ever walked by the Columbia restaurant in Ybor City, there's one thing you can't miss: the tiles. They're everywhere, hand-painted, vibrant, and they've got this incredible Spanish-Cuban vibe. These tiles don't just look pretty; they're a huge part of the Colombia's charm and its history. So, the first thing you notice is the Spanish influence. A lot of these tiles were actually made in Sevilla, Spain, back in the 1930s, and they were brought over as part of a restoration project in the 1970s. Cesar Gonsmart, who was running the place at the time, found these boxes of tiles and decided to transform the exterior with them. And thank goodness he did, right? You've got these murals that tell stories of Spanish history, like Christopher Columbus arriving in the New World, and others that feature beautiful floral and fruit designs. It's like a gallery right on the street. And it's not just about decoration. These tiles represent the cultural mix of Ybor City itself. You've got Spanish and Cuban influences blending together, much like the food at the Columbia. They're also a nod to the heritage of the area. So it's like these tiles are holding on to that history, keeping the past alive in this really colorful way. So next time you're in Ybor, take a minute to really look at those tiles. They're more than just decoration. They're pieces of history, art, and culture all wrapped up in one. All right, so let's talk about one of the things that really sets the Columbia apart. Its dedication to preserving Cuban culture here in the U.S. This place isn't just about food. It's a whole cultural experience. Every night you've got live flamenco performances. And let me tell you, that's something you don't find at just any restaurant. It's a tradition that's been going strong for decades. 6 nights a week, those flamenco dancers take the stage, and it's like being transported right into the heart of Spain. The energy, the music, the storytelling, it's electric. And while that's all happening, you're surrounded by this incredible Spanish-Cuban cuisine, like their famous paella or a Cuban sandwich that's as authentic as it gets. But really, it's more than just a show. It's about keeping those traditions alive, especially for a place like Ybor City, which has such deep Cuban roots. It's no wonder the Columbia is so widely praised for its role in preserving that cultural heritage. Whether you're there for the food or the flamenco, you leave with a taste of history. And that's what keeps people coming back, not just the food, but the feeling that you're part of something bigger. All right, so here's something exciting. The Columbia restaurant is gearing up to celebrate a huge milestone in 2025. Yep, they're turning 120 years old. Think about that for a second. 120 years of family recipes, Spanish-Cuban culture, and just a whole lot of history packed into this one iconic restaurant. They've announced plans for some special events to mark the occasion, though they're keeping the details under wraps for now. But if it's anything like their past anniversaries, it's going to be big. I mean, this is the restaurant that did things like 1905 Day, where they throw it back with prices from the early 1900s. And let's be honest, who wouldn't love a deal like that? It's not just about looking back, though. This anniversary is a reflection on the legacy they built, from surviving the Depression and Prohibition to helping preserve the culture of Ybor City. The Columbia is more than just a restaurant. It's part of Florida's history. So if you're thinking about making a trip, 2025 is definitely the year to do it. You'll get a chance to be part of this incredible celebration, marking 120 years of food, family, and of course, flamenco. Of course. So, the Columbia restaurant has been a family affair since day one, right? Well, it's still in the hands of the Gonsmart family, and now the 5th generation is stepping in, led by Andre Gonsmart Williams, who's taking on a bigger role. I mean, she's been around the place since she was like 10, doing everything from hostessing to managing. And now she's helping to guide the future of the restaurant group. Andrea's working right alongside her dad, Richard Gonsmart, who's been the driving force behind the Columbia for decades. But they're not just keeping things the same. They've really expanded. We're talking new restaurants, new concepts, all while keeping the heart of the Columbia intact. Andrea's not just about the business, though. She's all about preserving that family legacy, making sure the history and culture of the Columbia stay front and center as they grow. They've added spots like Eulalie and Goody Goody while still managing to maintain what makes the Columbia so special. And honestly, you can feel it in every one of their restaurants. It's got that same blend of tradition and innovation. It's really cool to see how they're balancing expansion with keeping that historical charm. Andrea is helping to shape the future, but it's all grounded in the values the Gone Smart families held for over a century. And that's something you just don't see too often these days. So if there's one thing we can take away from the Columbia restaurant, it's that it's so much more than just a place to grab a bite. I mean, it's a living testament to the immigrant experience here in Florida. You've got this rich mix of Cuban and Spanish culture that's been preserved for over a century, passed down through generations of the Gone Smart family. They've managed to keep that history alive, even as the world around them changed. You know, it's not just about the food, although, let's be honest, that's a big part of it. It's about a sense of community, of heritage, and of celebrating the past while still looking toward the future. Places like the Columbia remind us how important it is to preserve our history, especially when it comes to the immigrant communities that helped shape this state. So if you haven't been to the Columbia yet, what are you waiting for? Whether you're in Tampa, Sarasota, St. Augustine, or even catching a flight at Tampa International, there's a Columbia location for you. And while you're at it, why not explore other historic spots in Florida? The state's got some pretty amazing stories to tell. All right, that's it for this episode. Thanks for tuning in, folks. I'm Bo Carter, and you've been listening to Old Florida Now. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to Old Florida Now. Stay tuned for more stories from the Sunshine State's past. Until next time.